A sitting U.S. president orders a raid in Caracas. A foreign president is seized. More than 100 people are reported dead. And within days, that same U.S. president says he will welcome Colombia's leader to the White House with great honor. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and this is not chaos. This is how power speaks when it feels unchallenged. Donald Trump insults Colombia's president. He praises him. He threatens military action. Then he schedules a meeting. Drugs, oil, sovereignty. These words are not policy debates anymore. They are weapons. If you're trying to understand why Latin America feels on edge again, why one phone call can move markets and another can spark threats of war, stay with me. Because what looks like impulse is often strategy. And if this kind of analysis helps you see the world more clearly, take a moment to follow and stay connected. Now, let's slow this down and understand what is really at stake. What exactly is the problem here? On the surface, it looks personal. Donald Trump versus Gustavo Petro. Strong language, public insults, sudden reversals. But strip away the personalities, and a clearer structure appears. This is about control over drugs, over energy, over political alignment in the Western Hemisphere. Colombia is not just another country. It is a strategic hinge. It sits at the center of the cocaine trade the United States has fought for decades. It holds oil, coal, and critical minerals. And politically, it is led by a president who does not always speak Washington's language. When Trump talks about cocaine, he is not only talking about narcotics. When he talks about oil, Venezuelan or Colombian, he is not only talking about energy. He is defining loyalty and signaling consequences. For Petro, every word from Washington now carries weight, not just diplomatic, but existential. To understand why this moment escalated so fast, we need to look backward, not at Trump, but at the system that shaped this confrontation. To understand this, we have to step back. For decades, the United States has treated Latin America through a repeating cycle. Engagement, pressure, intervention, reset. Colombia has always been central to that cycle. It became a frontline state in the war on drugs, a partner in security, a supplier of energy and resources. But partnerships like this are rarely equal. When cocaine production rises, Washington sees failure. When it falls, Washington sees leverage. And when a leader like Gustavo Petro questions the old playbook, questions militarization, questions sanctions, questions obedience, the system reacts. Not emotionally, structurally. Add Venezuela to this equation, and the pressure multiplies. Oil sanctions, political isolation, then suddenly force. The raid in Caracas did not emerge in a vacuum. It came from years of unresolved tensions, frozen diplomacy, and the belief that decisive action can reset the board. History shows us something important here. Every time power believes speed equals control, instability follows. And that brings us to the first real rupture in this story, the moment everything crossed a line. The rupture came suddenly and violently. A U.S. operation in Caracas, the seizure of Nicolas Maduro. And then the numbers began to change. First, dozens dead. Then more than 100 Venezuelan officials spoke of Cuban soldiers killed alongside Venezuelans. The scale was far larger than initially admitted, and the message was unmistakable. This was not a warning shot. This was regime removal executed openly. For Washington, the logic was familiar. Remove the source of instability, restore order, reassert control, especially over oil. For the region, the meaning was far darker. If a sitting president could be taken by force, no leader felt untouchable. Not in Caracas, not in Bogota. Trump's words, spoken afterward, mattered as much as the raid itself. He mocked, he threatened, he signaled that others might be next. And if you're trying to make sense of how quickly norms collapsed here, pause and follow this analysis. Because Moments like this don't stay local. They radiate outward. And Colombia heard the message clearly. What followed was not outrage, but fear wrapped in diplomacy. And that leads us to the machinery beneath the spectacle. What you're seeing now is not improvisation. It's machinery. Beneath the insults, beneath the raids, beneath the sudden invitations to the White House, there is a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Power creates narratives. Narratives justify control. In this case, the narrative is drugs. Cocaine becomes the explanation for sanctions, for surveillance, for pressure on leaders who resist alignment. But notice how the mechanism works. When Colombia cooperates, it is called a partner. When it questions strategy, it becomes a problem. When production numbers rise, regardless of cause, blame becomes political. At the same time, energy quietly moves to the center. Venezuelan oil sales are controlled indefinitely. Restrictions are adjusted. Markets are signaled. Drugs explain the morality. Oil explains the urgency. And leaders like Petro are forced into a narrow corridor. Comply, confront, or recalibrate. This is why Trump can threaten one day and praise the next. The tone shifts. The structure does not. Once you see this mechanism, the next escalation feels almost inevitable because systems like this don't de-escalate on their own. They test limits, and the next test came faster and closer to ordinary people than anyone expected. The second shock did not come with helicopters or headlines. It came with words. Trump called Petro a criminal, a sick man, someone who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States. And then came the line that mattered most. He's not going to be doing it for very long. In diplomacy, that is not rhetoric. That is pressure. For Petro, the response was immediate and revealing. He did not talk about trade. He did not talk about aid. He talked about arms, about resistance, about what happens when sovereignty is crossed. This is how crises escalate now. Not through formal declarations, but through personal threats amplified by platforms, replayed by media, and absorbed by populations already on edge. Behind the scenes, sanctions remained, accusations hardened, and the space for quiet negotiation shrank. Notice the pattern. Military force in Venezuela, verbal force toward Colombia, diplomatic theater to contain the fallout. This is not war, but it is not peace either. It is coercion without a timetable. And when pressure moves from capitals to language, it inevitably moves next to lives. Because words from power are never abstract to the people who must live beneath them. And that is where this story turns away from presidents and toward you. If you live in Bogota or Medellin or a town far from any palace, this doesn't feel theoretical. It feels heavy because when Washington talks about cocaine production, it is not your statistics they see. It is your future they pressure. You feel it when sanctions tighten and prices rise. When uncertainty makes investors pause. When one sentence from a foreign leader makes your president respond with defiance instead of reassurance. You didn't vote for confrontation, but you inherit its consequences. And when Petro warns of arms, he is not speaking only to Washington. He is speaking to you, preparing minds for sacrifice, normalizing tension, lowering the threshold of fear. This is how geopolitics enters daily life. Not as maps or speeches, but as anxiety. If this analysis resonates, share it. Because understanding power is the first step toward protecting yourself from it. What makes this moment so dangerous is not ideology. It is unpredictability. When pressure replaces partnership, ordinary people become the buffer. And once that happens, the shockwaves don't stop at borders. They travel, which brings us to the world beyond Colombia and why this crisis matters far more than it first appears. What happens in Caracas or Bogota never stays there for long, because the moment the United States uses force to remove a president, every region recalculates. Not morally, strategically. Latin America watches and remembers its history. Europe watches and worries about precedent. Energy markets watch and react instantly. Venezuelan oil is now under US control indefinitely. Restrictions are adjusted. Signals are sent to traders, to allies, to rivals. This is not just about Venezuela's barrels or Colombia's coca fields. It is about who decides access and who enforces obedience. For countries sitting between Washington and Beijing, this matters deeply. If sovereignty can be overridden in the name of stability, then alignment becomes a survival choice. And notice the contradiction. The same action that projects strength also creates fear. Fear pushes states to hedge, to diversify partners, to look for alternatives. That is how power leaks. One intervention reshapes alliances. One threat rewrites diplomatic language. And suddenly, a regional crisis becomes a global signal. Rules are flexible, force is back, and certainty is gone. The world has seen this pattern before, and it never ends cleanly. So the real question is no longer what just happened, but what comes next. Because the future from here splits sharply. From this moment forward, there are three possible paths. The first is restraint. Diplomacy holds. The White House meeting becomes a reset, not just in tone, but in substance. Pressure eases, energy negotiations reopen, and Colombia remains a partner, not a target. This is the best outcome, but it requires something rare in moments like this: patience. The second path is managed tension. Public hostility continues. Sanctions remain. Threats are implied, not acted on. This is the most likely scenario. It feels stable, but it slowly corrodes trust, investment, and democratic confidence. Then there is the third path: escalation. Words harden into actions. Precedent invites repetition. And leaders, boxed in by pride and pressure, stop looking for exits. History tells us something sobering. Great powers rarely fall because they lack strength. They falter when they mistake dominance for durability. Systems built on coercion work until they don't. And when they fail suddenly. Which is why this moment matters more than it seems. Because how this story ends will tell us whether power in the 21st century can still correct itself or only accelerate. And that brings us to the final insight. What we are witnessing is not just a clash of leaders. It is a test of a system that believes pressure creates order. That speed creates control. That fear creates compliance. Sometimes it does briefly, but lasting stability has never come from humiliation or unpredictability. It comes from legitimacy, from rules that apply even when power is strong enough to ignore them. When a president can be seized, when threats replace diplomacy, when meetings follow insults, the message to the world is simple: outcomes matter more than process. And that is a dangerous lesson, because once power stops restraining itself, everyone begins planning for the worst. Not just governments, but people. If you want to understand the world you're entering, this is where you start, by watching how power behaves when it thinks no one can stop it. If this analysis helped you see the deeper pattern, stay with me. Follow, share, and be part of this conversation. Because the next chapter of global politics won't be written quietly. And the only real advantage citizens have is understanding what's coming before it arrives,